Chair Brandt, we are recording and broadcasting, and the webinar has been started.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board. And for the astute people out there, you may have noticed that we are meeting virtually rather than face-to-face this time. And we had originally planned to have a face-to-face meeting. And late last week, Sacramento County moved into the high transmission, community transmission rate. So we spent a couple of agonizing days doing, talking to various board members and deciding whether or not it was worrisome enough to change our meeting to a virtual meeting. And we decided with an abundance of caution to go ahead and have a virtual meeting this time. We have our next face-to-face meeting in August, and we are very hopeful that we'll never have to do this change again, and we'll be back in full swing again in face-to-face in August. I would like to really apologize for all those folks out there who had planned on attending in person, and I particularly want to apologize to the council staff and to our hosts who spent a lot of time putting together our field trip for this Friday and had to cancel it at the last minute. So I really thank you for your effort. I also want to thank Lisa, and who is our on-site representative in Sacramento during this next 2 days. So thanks to Lisa for doing that. So let's move on and talk about the public comment process. For those of you attending in person at any of our teleconference locations, please complete a blue slip and turn it into the meeting clerk. And when it's time for public comments, we will call you towards the presenter's table to provide your comment. And for those participating remotely, we will take written and oral comments. Please email your written public comments to disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. Indicate which agenda item you would like to have your public comment on, or if you prefer to do it orally, raise your hand or send an email to that same email address. And once you are recognized, we will please provide your full name and affiliation, and then the public comment. So I'd like to welcome Obe, who's our new board member, who started on June 1st. We will have a more formal introduction of him in tomorrow's meeting. But I also want to announce that today is the first time we've had full strength of our full board in almost 2 years. So I think that's a real achievement to get back to full strength, and we are very happy to be in this position now. I'll do the formal roll call and just state your full name and whether or not you have any new declarations. Steve Brandt, no new declarations. Virginia?
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
Joe?
No new declaration. Joe Fernando.
Tom?
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
Tanya?
Tanya Heikola, no new declarations.
Diane?
Diane McKnight, no new declarations.
Bob?
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
Obe?
Jayant Obesekara, I have no declarations at this time.
Lisa?
Major, no new declarations.
And I believe Jay Lund will not be here today. I think he's somewhere in the field. So today's agenda is one agenda item, and we're going to focus on the preparing for the Delta Conveyance Project EIR review. So I think we can move right into that agenda item number 2. And as background, in April of 2020, we submitted a public comment to DWR on the notice of preparation on the Delta Conveyance Project, indicating our plans to review the EIR and highlighting areas from previous reviews on the Delta Conveyance that DWR should consider in preparing their upcoming EIR. We've since been briefed on updates in August of 2020 and as recently as January of 2022 on the progress and where the review is heading, and helps in helping us to get prepared to do that major effort. So today we have a number of people who will be provide an update on where that review is and where the EIR is and what the content of the EIR is, and then afterwards, and after we have some time for questions and so forth, then the board will talk about how we might move forward with further preparation for that and doing that review. So Karla Nemeth is heading this group, and she's the director of the California Department of Water Resources. And so Karla, the floor is yours, and I'll let you introduce your folks as you see fit. And thanks for being here and providing this update for us.
You bet. Well, thank you, Chair Brandt and members of the Independent Science Board. I also wish circumstances were such that we could be all together in person, but we'll have to wait a little bit longer. And I also very much appreciate the board's decision to transition this into a virtual meeting for public health safety. So thank you. I do have a full complement of DWR scientific staff available to walk through where we are with the Delta Conveyance Project and key scientific issues that are shaping the environmental review document that we anticipate releasing later this summer for public review and comment, and certainly the very important role that the Independent Science Board plays in review of that document as well. With me, I have Lenny Grimaldo, Andrew Schwartz, Amardeep Singh, Steve Juliana Burkhoff, and then Carrie Buckman will be our closer, if you will, and she's the overall project manager for the Delta Conveyance Project. Carrie and I both thought it was important for this board to hear directly from these experts. I'm sure they can do much more of a comprehensive job peer-to-peer than I could do as a non-scientist. But I deeply value the scientific peer review process and really welcome this opportunity today to get into more detail on the Delta Conveyance Project. Next slide, please. I'm fairly certain I just covered all of this. That's our agenda, and we'll get through the PowerPoint as quickly as we can so that we can allow for ample time for questions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as you may all be aware, California and the State Water Project, which was developed in the 1960s, has sort of long contemplated the notion of intakes in the North Delta and routing water around the estuary for purposes of human consumption. That's been a project that has, or a need rather, that has taken many twists and turns over the decades. And most recently in the mid-2000s, really came back to the forefront of state water project planning, in large part because we do view the Delta as really a linchpin in the state water project writ large. We have storage facilities north of the Delta, pumping facilities in the Delta, and then hundreds of miles of aqueduct that take this water to water users in the Bay Area, in the Central Valley, and then the central coast of California, and then all the way down to Southern California and San Diego County bordering Mexico. So really important piece of the water supply picture for 27 million Californians. And certainly with the ongoing and accelerated effects of climate, this project is becoming, I think, more and more vital to not only the State Water Project, but the way in which it supports other important investments California needs to make, particularly as it relates to managing groundwater basins sustainably, but also significant investments in recycled water, so that we can move California to a position where it can really weather deepening droughts that we know are coming with the onset of climate. So again, this is a project that has itself just physically taken a lot of twists and turns. Most recently, Governor Newsom 3 years ago directed the Department of Water Resources to pursue a project that was a single tunnel project, so smaller than previous iterations. Again, also a project that runs underground. We took that direction and determined that given how far the project had, or how much the project had changed over the previous 15 years, we wanted to pursue environmental documents anew, rather than work with the old and continue to adjust. A lot of that, frankly, just related to basic clarity around the proposed project and its impacts. We do believe that the project is essential to a more extreme hydrology future that we anticipate in California, that I think, frankly, we experienced just this year, where it's very possible to have, in the midst of an acute drought, to have very intense storm events. So the notion here is an ability to divert water in the northern part of the Delta and divert it under the Delta will enable the State Water Project to operate more flexibly in reaction to more extreme hydrologic events. It also helps us to improve seismic risk of the system. It's not the only place where the State Water Project has a seismic risk, but it is a key place where it does. And so again, a primary purpose of the project is to help the State Water Project avoid significant outages as a result of an earthquake event in the Delta or the environment. We have really spent the last 3 years working very intensely on conceptual engineering. It was something that was not well developed in previous iterations of the project. And when we got the direction from Governor Newsom, one of the things that we wanted to do was to really take a hard look at the routing of the project and the impacts that it would be causing communities in the Delta in particular. And that has led us to significant project changes as a way to either eliminate altogether or dramatically reduce impacts, because we know a construction period is going to be a long period. And this is a project that is fundamentally supporting water users that are not affected by its construction and not affected in the same way by its operations. So we spent a considerable amount of time adjusting the project based on improved engineering information. And then finally, we've been working, I think, more intensively on community engagement, including disadvantaged communities and tribes. We do have new obligations. Assembly Bill 52 requires a deeper degree of consultation with tribal nations, and this project is putting together that program as well. And I think we learned a bit from the previous project about better environmental justice kinds of outreach and work that we need to do to develop a project that is responsive to those communities. You will also hear a little bit about a community benefits program separate from CEQA, which is our effort to identify ways in which a significant construction project can also bring potential lasting community benefits to the areas in and around the Delta. So all of those things we wanted to touch on today in this presentation. Next slide, please. So just a quick recap. I always feel like, when we're discussing these big systems and we do things with, fairly gross kinds of modeling analyses or averages over longer periods of time, it really helps to get grounded in what's happening around us and what the role of a facility like this would be. And as I mentioned, this kind of year has been in certain ways almost textbook, if we can even say that about climate change and uncertainty. But my point is, this year was a very stark example, again, of the fact that we can have very intense dry conditions that are punctuated with intense storm events, and it can collectively continue to be an extremely dry year. But that doesn't mean it won't rain in California. And a big part of California's strategy to become more climate resilient is to be able to move water during those, and move and store water during those very intense storm events, so that we have more water in storage to enable us to survive better during drought years. We also know that during drought years, there tends to be very intense pressures also on aquatic ecosystems, and our ability to move water when it is wet enables us to leave more water in the system than when it's dry, or at a minimum really lessen the conflict that we experience collectively in California when we have dry conditions, in terms of having enough water to support our communities and our economy and our ecosystem. So just this past year, we had that fantastic December. Unfortunately, that sigh of relief did not last for too long, because that very intense December storm events, where in some places in the Sierra, we broke all records and we were about, I think, 220% of average for December. And then we proceeded into 3 absolutely spectacularly dry months. Though that January, February, and March was by far the driest wet season on record. And when I tell you we blew through the previous dry record for our wet season months, we blew through it by a lot. The previous record, I think, had been about 15 inches of rain during that 3-month period. This last year, we had about 5.5 inches of rain. So you can really see this accelerating effect. So, in hindsight, had we had this Delta Conveyance Project in place with operating criteria as we're proposing, so I just want to put an asterisk about that. It's not an approved project. We expect a lot more dialogue with biological agencies that would adjust those criteria further. But as a general matter, we think that having this project in place, we could have safely moved about 236,000 acre feet of water simply by taking advantage of the new intakes and this big storm event. Then we were able to move, given the pump's location in the South Delta and challenges that we have in the early part of our wet season when we get a big storm event. Actually, typically one of the things that we do is we turn down the pumps because we don't want to disrupt initial cues around migration that can happen with these sort of early storm events. And we don't want to bring turbidity down into the southern part of the Delta. And so that is just a real key thing that additional intakes can avoid. And that has a material effect during these large storm events in terms of moving water past the Delta and into storage for use later in the season. So next slide, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is a lot of our thinking is designed around the new this new normal. And I think probably, frankly, I've already said all of this. So maybe next slide, please. So we have a project purpose as articulated in our NOP and specific project objectives. What we're focused on is modernizing this particular link in the State Water Project, which is essentially aging. There are other parts of the State Water Project that are also aging. We do have an asset management program for the State Water Project writ large. And so all of these things are really meant to be moving together. But for this specific project, it is focused on essentially rehabilitating this link in the system so that we can move water for the State Water Project more reliably into the future. Our objectives are to address sea level rise and climate change effects on the State Water Project, not on the system writ large, but sea level rise and climate change effects on the State Water Project. We also want to, as I mentioned, minimize water supply disruption that could result from a seismic event, an earthquake in the Delta or its environment. We do want to protect water supply reliability. As a general matter, the State Water Project and the Department of Water Resources certainly understands that with climate into the future, temperature is going to add an additional demand on the water that we manage for communities, fisheries, and the economy in California. There's no question. With rising temperatures, we will have a higher evaporative demand. So this project itself is about working within that context to make the supplies that we do have available to us, make those supplies actually move more reliably through our system. And then finally, we do want to enable some operational flexibility that will actually help us improve aquatic conditions. One of the most exciting things that the State Water Project, together with our federal counterparts, has been working on this past year is we have introduced Delta smelt back into the system, smelt that were raised in captivity. And frankly, it's been a long time since we've seen positive signals in the Delta around smelt species. And we did see some early promise with that strategy. And projects like this one enable the State Water Project to operate more flexibly in these kinds of circumstances so that we can help these fishery populations in a whole variety of ways, not just through operational manipulations of the State Water Project and other parties, but how we think about habitat restoration and how we think about some of these other methods that are available to us to help support these species. Next slide, please. So here I want to turn it over to Lenny Grimaldo to discuss our approach to aquatic resources in the environmental document. And I should just add, as we move through the environmental review document, it is a different regulatory framework than things that the project needs to do for endangered species protections. That are specific under federal law and specific under state law. So today's presentation is really focused on the the California Environmental Quality Act framing around how we treat these resources, but additional information is under development in the context of things we need to do under Endangered Species Act. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Grimaldo.
Thank you, Karla. So I'm thinking about the aquatic resources approach and what Karla just set up for the project. Up front, DWR was considering how we can minimize impact, especially on the engineering and technology front. So to that end, the diversion was developed with the smaller capacity split between 2 intakes. We think that that's going to help with our impacts to aquatic resources, but also putting together a committee to develop different screening technology and landing on a T-screen technology that we think will help reduce the in-water footprint and provide a barrier to minimize fish entrainment as they move down the river. Next slide. And in addition to the engineering and technology items, we're also, as Karla just mentioned, thinking about operational criteria that would help minimize those potential effects, including being focused on periods of excess conditions in the Delta, making use of that water when it comes through, as Karla mentioned in an earlier slide. Develop approach and sweeping velocity restrictions to minimize potential impacts at the intake screens. And we're hoping that this would minimize those near field effects at the point at which fish become or in close contact to the screens. And also developing bypass flow criteria and pulse protection to further restrict diversions based on flows in the Sac River and potential exposure of listed fish from the far field side of things. And focusing on operations that would be that occurred during the day. There's a lot of new research out there that suggests that fish move at night. So trying to think about items even within the project that are actions within the project that would help minimize those exposure will be important. Next slide. With climate change and a lot of the items that Karla mentioned on the hydrology front, it's not just the hydrology that's likely to change over time. We should expect species will respond differently as we see different water temperatures, different ways in the way that water moves through the system in the future. So I think for us, it's really important to keep our keep focused on the best available science, and as it merges through from now through project implementation. So a couple of things that we're working on is getting input from fish agency staff and including different analyses and runs that help address these different scenarios, and making sure that we're using top-notch science to address emerging and changing needs of the species. Next slide. Up front, DWR is proposing a couple different mitigation measures to offset our impacts, both to our construction activities and to our operational effects. This includes channel margin habitat to help address the footprint of the North Delta diversion itself, but also tidal marsh restoration and channel margin habitat to deal with changes in flows that result from the North Delta diversion and our operations. Next slide. And I think what's going to be really important as we move through with project implementation is adaptive management and our ability to address uncertainty. As I mentioned, with climate change, we expect for species to respond differently to a changing ecosystem. We need to keep focused on the new science that emerges and how we're going to build this into our management decisions. So having a robust monitoring program and adaptive management program to compare and characterize the baseline versus that with project conditions is going to be important. And we know that this is in the wheelhouse of the ISB. So we're looking forward from comments from the board on this front. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Short.
Thanks, Lenny. Can you all hear me? I had to switch to a new mic. Good. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change. I think Director Nemeth talked a lot about it already, so I'm going to move through this material really quickly. But the first thing to really understand about California's hydrology and what we're dealing with and trying to manage water supplies in the state is that our climate here is uniquely variable and difficult to predict. In this graphic, you're seeing coefficient of variation of annual precipitation across the country. You can see the greens and blues and blacks in California, showing that we've got the highest year-to-year variability in precipitation. And that's kind of part of the the core of what we're doing with managing water year to year in California, and climate change really makes this worse. And this project is part of our way to deal with that increasing variability. Next slide. Other trends that we're already seeing affecting us in California. Climate change isn't something that happens in the future. It's already upon us. We're looking at temperatures that are 0.5 degree to 1.5 degrees warmer, snowpack that's smaller and melts earlier. So that runoff is coming during the season where we've typically been operating multi-purpose reservoirs for flood protection and not trying to hold back as much of that water for water supply. So we're not able to capture that earlier runoff. We've got mean sea levels in California that are increased 6 inches or more in the last 40 years. And so that's kind of like a hole in the bottom of the bucket, if you will, that just is a chronic drain where we have to release more, a little bit more storage every year just to repel that salinity and keep the delta fresh. And then precipitation is becoming more and more variable and more extreme. As Director Nemeth talked about, 2022 is a case in point where we've really seen that in our day-to-day lives already. Next slide. So some of the best available science on the impacts of climate change. A new study that came out from the Delta Stewardship Council just a few years ago, Delta Adapts, had some key findings on water supply and flood impacts for the Delta. And as Director Nemeth talked about, temperature change alone creates this new demand and reduces water supply. And they estimated that Delta exports would be decreased by 500 to 600,000 acre feet per year by 2050, just on the basis of temperature increases. That change in more variable precipitation by 2050 really hits us in the driest 25% of years. We can't actually, without additional infrastructure like Delta Conveyance and storage, we can't store the additional water that comes in those wet years, but we get extra hurt by those years that are drier and more dry than they would have been without climate change. And that's another 200,000 acre feet. And then sea level rise really, as I said, is just a chronic impact that drives down our storage and really hits hard when we have very dry years and can have high levels of shortage of water because we've entered those droughts with lower storage levels and less protection. And then significant areas of the South and Central Delta are highly vulnerable to flooding from sea level rise and larger storms. And as we know, the Delta is a key cog center hub of the water supply system. And that flooding really threatens not just people and agriculture, but our water supply system. And this project really helps to address that. Next slide. So just shifting gears to, those are some of the impacts that are happening and that we know are going to happen in the future, and talking about how that will be addressed in the CEQA document. So what CEQA requires is an analysis of what the proposed impacts are on the environment. So in those sections of the document, we'll really be talking about how the project's energy use and pumping of water contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and how that can contribute to the continuing problem of climate change through emissions. And then any other environmental impacts that become worse because of climate change. So environmental impacts that would be caused by the project that could be worse with a warmer future climate or a changed hydrologic climate. What CEQA does not require is an analysis of climate change impacts on the proposed project. So that is not required by CEQA. However, there will be some information in the document that goes to address some of these issues and talks about how some of these changes, how the project would function in a warmer world with changed hydrology and how it can be robust and actually help us adapt to some of those conditions. But that is not a required section in CEQA. Next slide. So just connecting some of those, what I just talked about, to what DWR has been doing more broadly on climate change, been very proactive. We've had a climate action plan that we started in 2012. That includes a greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan that'll get us to 100% electricity load and zero carbon resources by 2045. So we'll be carbon neutral by 2045. Even with this project, if it were built and operated under the State Water Project, we will still get and hit those goals. So there's no change in DWR's GHG emissions, essentially. We still meet our goal with the project and the additional operations of this project. Phase 2 of the climate action plan really talks about consistent climate change analysis across all DWR programs and projects. And this project has been analyzed within the DWR framework. And so that's consistent with what we're doing on other projects and make sure that it meets our rigorous standards for best available science and consistency. And then finally, phase 3 is a vulnerability assessment, which was completed a couple of years ago. And then Delta Adapts really kind of built on some of the things that were analyzed in that assessment, and then an adaptation process where we understand that we're going to have to adapt over a period of time and continuously to changing conditions. And that's not just one plan that sits on the shelf and you do a bunch of things and then you're done. That's a process where we're going to have to continue to evaluate and add pieces to our infrastructure and our actions and activities over time. And this is really part of that silver buckshot, not silver bullet approach. Next slide. So just kind of summing all of that up, you know, our current climate is highly variable. We know that climate change is really going to increase that variability and the difficulty of managing the system. And so that leaves a lot of uncertainty for water managers. And really for water management in the face of climate change, flexibility is going to be a key objective. And in a way that we continue to be able to function and bring services and water to the people of California. And really this project really fits in with the core function of the State Water Project, which has always been storing and moving water when it's available to meet water needs during dry periods throughout the state. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amardeep, who can talk a little bit more about some of the modeling that we're doing.
Thanks, Andrew. So good afternoon. So I'll be quickly talking about a brief overview of different models and methods that we're using to analyze the project. So this chart here or figure here is listing some of the models that we're using. At the center is a calcium model that simulates a State Water Project and CVP operations, including the proposed node delta diversions. So we are using the latest version of calcium, which is calcium 3 for this project. This was jointly released by DWR and Reclamation last year. So it is the latest and best available tool that we have to look at operations. So inputs to calcium include hydrology. So for existing conditions, it will be historical hydrology. For climate change scenario, we have a climate change hydrology that is generated based on changes in temperature and precip from the climate models. Calcium also uses flow salinity relationships, and we have developed these relationships for both existing conditions and also for future scenario with sea level rise at 2040. So the output from calcium 3 goes to a series of different models. One of the models that I'll be focusing today is DSM-2 that looks at hydrodynamics and water quality in the Delta. So, you know, the same framework that we have here was used for existing condition and also a future at 2040 with and without project. Next slide. So this table here is a quick high-level assumptions. Basically, as I mentioned, we are looking at 2020 and also a future scenario at 2040 that takes into account climate change hydrology. So this table is just summarizing some of the main assumptions in terms of demand and hydrology, how we are climate changes, in terms of transforming those inflows into calcium, a regulatory baseline that is based on biological opinions and ITP that exists today. In terms of sea level rise for the future scenario 2040, we are using a projection of 1.8 feet, which is an extreme projection based on Ocean Protection Council guidance released in 2018. Next slide. So for climate change hydrology, we used the available climate models and selected 10 models that were recommended by DWR's Climate Change Advisory Group that are suitable for planning studies in California. So using those models, we developed the future hydrology at 2040 for the project. Next slide. Going into water quality analysis. Output from, like I mentioned, output from calcium goes into DSM-2 that looks at the water quality in the Delta. But for the water quality, we started with a screening analysis. That was first step to identify constituents of concern that warrant detailed analysis. A list was developed, more than 438 water quality constituent classes. And this was based on existing data, current federal and state objectives and standards, professional judgment, and also some of the comments we received from public scoping. And then these constituents were further narrowed down based on available data or whether they were detected and in the historical monitoring information that we have. And from these, over 438 constituents, we narrowed it down to about 60. And depending on whether we have modeling tools and data available, we either did a qualitative or a quantitative assessment with and without project. Next slide. So this is just a list of constituents groups that we are doing qualitative analysis. Again, the qualitative analysis for those constituents that didn't have any models available. Most of them are looking at sources of those constituents to the surface water or delta waters, and the concentrations there and how the project could potentially change those sources or those concentrations. We did use some DSM-2 model results to help qualitative discussion for dissolved oxygen and CHABs, where we use channel velocity and temperature for dissolved oxygen, and for CHABs, we looked at residence time, temperature, and velocities from DSM-2 to help that qualitative assessment. Next slide. So this is a list of water quality constituents where we did quantitative assessments. So again, this was based on DSM-2 models for EC and organic carbon. DSM-2 directly models that. DSM-2 also provides the different assessment locations, different source water fractions. So for a given location, we have ability to see how much Sacramento River water, how much sea water, or how much San Joaquin water is there. And based on those and known concentration, we can use mass balance to calculate concentrations of these constituents. So we did use DSM-2 fingerprinting to do that for some of the listed constituents here. And in addition, we also used some available regression equations that relate EC to bromide and chloride for Western Delta locations to calculate concentrations. So just an overview of different screening that we used and quantitative and qualitative assessment that will be in the IR. So just wanted to provide a quick overview of that. Next slide. So I think Steve, it's your slides now.
All right, thank you. So the socioeconomic section of the EIR incorporates a number of descriptions of economic and social and demographic conditions, and then assesses how those might be affected by project construction or operation. So a couple of contextual items here. So under CEQA, social or economic effects alone aren't generally treated as impacts on the physical environment. But we have included the analysis here for several important reasons. One, there's significant public interest, and it provides just a more complete picture of the project area and possible effects. We have a companion NEPA analysis, which is the federal environmental impact document that does have a bit more requirements related to socioeconomics, so for consistency. And some of this information may be used to make decisions about whether mitigations or avoidance of effects are feasible. And then another important point is that, a CEQA analysis is not any kind of comprehensive benefit cost analysis. You will certainly see things in it that relate to benefits or costs, but there's no formal compilation and quantification in a way that some people might expect. Next slide. All right, so there's sort of three basic rules that we have taken in our methods here. First, of course, is to find the best and most recent data on which to base our description of the conditions and our assessment of potential changes. And then we want, importantly, to be consistent with what all of the other analyses in the EIR are doing in their other resources chapters, importantly, including the agricultural resources and recreation chapters. So we have used the same data augmented as necessary for our particular analysis, but our particular approach to it, but otherwise consistent. And then use widely accepted and understood methods and for our analysis, and do it in a quantitative way where that is appropriate and applicable. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of kind of examples. I'll go through these fairly rapidly. So you think of sort of the big picture economic effects on jobs and local income and those aspects of people's lives within the study area. And so the construction and operation of the project itself is the largest one quantitatively. And so we have received estimates by year from the project design team on the employment during project construction and operation. On the, if you will, on the flip side of that, we know that the project footprint is going to affect existing land uses, and most significantly agricultural land uses. So we also need to look at the effect of that. So we have incorporated those into what's called an input-output, a regional economic impact model that would then give us, in addition to those direct effects, the so-called multiplier effects, or indirect and induced. And we use the M-plan model. It's widely used. I am fairly sure it's the most widely used, at least in the United States, of these kinds of models. But importantly, DWR, the Department of Water Resources, uses this as its standard model for assessing regional economic effects of projects and programs. And then we, of course, took that model and used the most recently available version of it, including most appropriate data set. Next slide. For agricultural production, again, this linkage to the GIS and land use analysis that is in other parts of the EIR. So we took that as our starting point to identify acres of crops affected by the project footprint, in other words, taken out of production by construction and or operation. Gathered the most recent data on the value of production of that, used that information with the M-plan model to assess sort of the larger picture with multiplier effects of taking that land out of production. In addition to that, we present other basic information describing the agricultural economy in the area from best available sources. And then all dollar-related estimates, of course, we've indexed to a common point in time. Next slide. So just quickly run through, there's of course a number of other effects that are incorporated into the socioeconomics section of the document. Quantitatively, we can use, and we've used the sort of the employment and economic effects to make estimates about changes in population and housing demand using information from the State Department of Finance, for example, on typical household size for employees that move into the region for purposes of the construction process. And then we've augmented that with sort of basic descriptive data of population and demographics and housing from appropriate sources. In addition, with the qualitative assessment, as Amardeep described, we've mixed quantitative where appropriate, but with qualitative assessment, looking at issues of community character and recreation effects and local fiscal conditions. I'll come back to that one. But in these regards, we have relied heavily and consistently on the results from the other sort of physical resource chapters of the document. Things like noise and aesthetic effects, transportation, anything that could affect sort of the community character. And we draw that together and describe how that could affect the community character. And then finally, I wanted to mention local fiscal conditions, and that's an item that has often been brought up in scoping comments. And just to point out that state law is going to requires that the project compensate for tax effects of land out of production and similar effects on local agencies. Finally, effects in the south of Delta, the water export areas, the areas that will benefit from the water reliability provided by the project. Again, these are very large, broad areas. We've described the kinds of effects. They will be consistent with the growth inducement chapters, also looking at that as an important topic for it. So we have included a descriptive text about the kinds of effects those might have in areas receiving the export water. So that's a very quick overview of socioeconomic chapter. I will turn it to Carrie, I think is next.
Thank you. I'm going to provide a quick overview of how we're looking at environmental justice within the CEQA process, and then hand this over to Dr. Berghoff to talk more about our environmental justice work. So in general, CEQA does not require an analysis of environmental justice, but there are multiple state policies that do instruct state agencies to consider the impacts of their actions on environmental justice communities. This is pretty similar to economics, as Dr. Hatchett just described. So we have to look under the CEQA process at potential significant environmental impacts, but economic or social changes, including environmental justice, are not in and of themselves a significant impact to the environment, according to CEQA. Next slide, please. So while CEQA does not require an environmental justice analysis, we recognize the importance of this consideration, and so we are including information in the EIR. So what we're doing is that we're looking at the CEQA analyses and other resource chapters that all use best available science and most current data to evaluate those resources. And then when we identify an impact from those resources, we're looking at it in the environmental justice analysis to determine if it could have disproportionate effects on minority or low-income communities. And those are defined as census blocks with greater than 50% total minority population and census blocks where low-income households constitute greater than 20% of the population. Next slide, please. So the way that we're looking at this analysis, looking at the resource chapter, if an impact is less than significant or has no effect as a conclusion, we don't carry that forward into the environmental justice analysis. But where an impact is potentially significant, we do consider that in the environmental justice analysis to determine if it could have a disproportionately high and adverse impact on an environmental justice population. So we look at both the significant impact that's identified, and then we also consider the mitigation measure because we want to make sure that mitigation measures are applied appropriately and don't in and of themselves disproportionately affect an environmental justice population. And one thing I wanted to mention is we are working on a robust community benefits program as part of this proposed project. We talked about it the last time I was here. And that community benefits program is part of the proposed project, but it is not considered environmental mitigation or mitigation for environmental justice impacts. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Berkhoff for more on environmental justice.
Next slide, please. Great. So as Ms. Buckman said, we, Ag Innovations, has been working with DWR on the environmental justice and disadvantaged characterization and outreach for the Delta Conveyance Project. So the first thing that we did was conduct a survey in fall of 2020 to find out from people how they worked, lived, recreated, and experienced the Delta. We were particularly reaching out to the disadvantaged communities in the Delta. We also wanted to know how they valued and used natural, economic, and social resources. We wanted to have that information to inform the EJ chapter, as Ms. Buckman just said. We also wanted to make sure people knew, using the survey, make sure people knew about the Delta Conveyance Project. We wanted to see if we could increase the disadvantaged community members' interest in participating in those public engagement activities. And we really focused on the historically burdened, underrepresented people of color and the low-income communities in the Delta. So next slide, please. I'd be happy to tell people all the different things that we did to get that survey out, but and the kind of outreach we conducted to get that robust response. So we got the environmental justice survey, and then the way it's being used in the EIR analysis, what we looked through is how the environmental changes could be used and the effect on the environmental justice population in the study area. When we looked through our information, we looked at what kind of priorities there were, preferences, activities, and concerns. And we summarized those key themes into the community priorities, preferences, economic well-being, how they experience the Delta, special places. There was a place on the survey where people could use a map and put in what a special place was and why it was a special place, what their outdoor activities were and where they participated in those, if they had any historic or cultural resources. And although we mapped all of those are all protected so that they can't be used inappropriately. We asked people about business services and other special places. Next slide, please. So from that, we began the environmental justice and the disadvantaged community outreach. We know that there's no one-size-fits-all way to conduct outreach to people and get people to participate. It needs to be unique to the project, people, and places. So we used the information from the Your Delta, Your Voice environmental justice survey, as well as interviews with state agencies, NGO, EJ leaders, and a lot of Delta community leaders to develop our goals. So our goals for the outreach have been that people will know about and understand what the proposed Delta Conveyance Project is and its timeline, It's important with a project that's had different iterations that people know what this current project is. Understand how or if this project will affect or not their priorities and interests. So learn how to understand what the project is and where they are and whether it'll affect them. Understand how or why it's worth their time and effort to participate, and then are prepared to actually participate in the project's public input processes. We had a number, next slide, please. From those goals, we developed a number of different strategies. Those strategies are based on meeting people where they're at, whether those were farmers markets or vaccine locations, food pantries, school activities, church coffee hours, a wide variety, a lot of festivals. And we also wanted to make sure that we worked with the community-based organizations. So they were our partner. They led us to where we should go, or if we wanted to meet online with somebody or in person, they helped us with that, as well as they helped us figure out whether social media was appropriate and in what language and with what kind of group. So for example, and then finally, we also use traditional media, relying on radio PSAs, public service announcements, to get to the people who were subsistence farming and fishing people in the Delta. So you can see there's a lot of people we've talked to over the last, 7 months. And we made sure that we had people at each event to speak the different languages. And we made sure that we had people translating all the material as we went forward. So I'd be happy to answer any more questions about how we conducted our environmental injustice and disadvantaged community outreach strategies in the question period. Let me turn it back to Ms. Buckman.
Thanks, Juliana. We're almost there. I know we've presented a whole lot of information. So the last time I was here, we talked a lot about the proposed project and the alternatives. And this time we've tried to bring you a suite of information about the science that we're using in the EIR and the analytical methods. And so we're hoping that this combined set of information will really prepare you for your review of the draft EIR. So I'm just going to touch on a few logistics because I know I got a number of questions about how to plan your review. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the review process and some information that might help you in those discussions, and then we'll be ready for questions. So a little bit about logistics. We are planning to release the draft in midsummer for a 90-day public review period. The Corps is developing a separate draft environmental impact statement, and that is going to be coming out likely shortly after the draft EIR for a shorter review period, but I'm not exactly sure the length of time they're settling on. The review periods will overlap, but will not be identical. The draft EIS will have similar information to the draft EIR, but there are a few differences I wanted to highlight. The Corps has some requirements for brevity, so the EIS will be shorter and will summarize and refer to the EIR in some areas. NEPA has different ways to determine the importance of impacts. They do not have the same types of significance findings as an EIR. And the baseline for the impact analysis is different. So in CEQA, we compare the conditions with the proposed project and alternatives to existing conditions at the time of the NOP. Under NEPA, they will compare the conditions with the proposed project or alternatives to the future no action alternative. So it's a different timeline for the impact analysis. Next slide, please. And we talked about this at the last meeting, but I think just because of the timing, I wanted to again highlight some of the key types of things that we usually do have people look for in a CEQA review. So typically people look at the project description to determine if the project is described well enough so that people have an understanding of the project and can identify if the potential environmental effects are complete. The environmental setting, if the physical environment is adequately described based on available information. The impacts, and that includes direct, indirect, growth-inducing, and cumulative impacts. Are they evaluated in light of what is reasonably foreseeable? The alternatives are feasible alternatives evaluated that meet project objectives and would avoid or reduce potential significant impacts of the proposed project. And mitigation. Are mitigation measures included that would avoid, minimize, or compensate for a potentially significant impact? Next slide. So I understand that one of the things you're interested in is the length of the document. So just a little bit of information here, the executive summary, and let me really highlight that these are preliminary numbers. I am expecting they will change before the release of the document, but this will give you an idea about order of magnitude. So the executive summary is about 130 pages. The introductory material is about 240 pages. The resource chapters are about 2,800 pages. And then the supporting appendices and additional information are about 15,000 pages. But I want to be really careful. I know that looks like a big number, but much of that material is modeling output, and we include that for reference, so you can check it if you want to, but I would guess that you're not going to be doing a page-by-page review of the modeling output. And we have provided to the DSC staff a breakdown of this by chapter, so you can see each chapter, the page numbers by chapter, and the page numbers for the appendices. And you'll see there that like the big numbers are for the modeling appendices. So that should help. Next slide, please. So we did include some links in the presentation for our website in case you have some additional ideas that you want to check out. So we have our homepage as well as updates and public information. And there's quite a bit of information there, blog posts, videos that we've been working on if you're curious about other things before the draft DIR comes out. And I think with that, Chair Brent, we are ready for any questions.
Okay, thank you all for a wealth of information, and that's just what we need. We'll open it up for a board discussion, so board members, please raise your hand and I'll take you in the order that I see them. And the while you're looking for your hand raise, I'll just ask two simple questions. What is midsummer?
I don't know yet. If I knew, I would give you a better date. We're working on it.
Technically, it's August 21st, but I mean, is that sort of roughly the time frame?
I wish I could tell you. We're still working on the details.
I can't pin you down. Okay. The second question relates to what our earlier comments we've had on previous things, is that where we've asked for chapter summaries. I see you have a 130-page executive summary. Is that going to be in a format that we can have like chapter summaries? Is that a compilation of the chapter summaries? Or so if someone is doing aquatic resources, then like we said before, it'd be nice to have a succinct summary, so then we can dive into the details.
So we have not done individual chapter summaries, but we have done a couple of summary things that hopefully will be helpful. One of them is the executive summary, and that does include a table that summarizes all of the impacts throughout the entire document. The other thing that I think we've talked about before is we're working on a summary that is not, I would say, really focused on summarizing the EIR, but trying to really provide more information for a layperson about the project and key things that they should know. So one of the things that we've heard a lot about CEQA documents in general is that they're not always conducive to public understanding. You know, it's a pretty complex legal document, and that's often hard for people to really read and understand. So what we're doing with this other external summary is that we're summarizing the proposed project and the alternatives, and we're looking at key resources and some of the important findings and trade-offs in a way that isn't intended to be comprehensive, but will hopefully highlight some of the things that are of the most interest and the most important for people to understand, really to try to get at the idea that we understand from many people who've talked to us that it's hard for people to read the whole document, and this is a way to get to some of the highlights.
Yes, and last comment is I'm glad you, I did have a question about the nature of the content of the appendices. And if it's a matter of that's where the equations are and that's where the literature review is and that's where the rationale is, that means we got to read it. If it's just appendices are stacks and stacks of tables of numbers, that's something different. It sounds like it's more towards the latter.
It's a mix. So I guess what I was trying to say is I didn't want you to worry too much when you saw 15,000 pages that you had to read 15,000 pages, because much of that, I'd say probably, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but probably almost 75% of that is tables of numbers. But there are things in the appendices that will be important. So I don't want to minimize it, that none of it is worth not worth reading. That's not the right term. Much of it is something that you will want to read page for page. It's really the page for page thing that I was trying to highlight, that some of those tables are not likely to be read page by page.
Okay, let's go to Lisa and then Tom.
Thank you. Because I unmuted by habit. Sorry about that. Okay. I appreciate that overview. I appreciate there's a lot of science that we're going to get a lot of details on very soon. So I don't want to dig into a lot of minutia. There's a lot of important things, but one thing, the whole analysis seems to really hinge on something that was covered very, very briefly, which was we went from climate scenarios to hydrology. And so I wonder if I could just get a little bit more about how you translated that into a number of extreme storms, you know, the things that are really relevant to this project. And that was for Amardeep Singh.
So basically, like I mentioned in my modeling framework, you know, we have different models that we're using. Of course, the base is our calcium model that looks at, you know, hydrology and then system operations. And since we're doing a lot of downstream analysis, so we have to come up with like a representative or a one scenario that represents, you know, future climate change scenario. So what we did was we looked at what are the different you know, climate models that are available, and like I mentioned, working based on recommendations from CC-TAG, we selected, you know, 10 models that are good for, you know, water planning studies in California. And based on those models, you know, we looked at what the projected changes in temperature and precip is, and basically using some additional steps, we generated, you know, hydrology that inputs into calcium. And then definitely there is, you know, a shift in basically a seasonal pattern that we're seeing for our 2040 scenario, where in the wintertime we have higher flows, in later part of the year there is, you know, reduction in runoff. So again, you know, it is kind of consistent with what the science is saying in terms of what the future would be with climate change. So taking all that, and in addition, you know, sea level rise, incorporating that into modeling, that's what we looked at overall, you know, project alternatives, and compared that with baseline.
Okay, I hope we get some more details in the report itself. Thank you.
Okay, Tom, then Diana.
Yeah, I think it's primarily for Amardeep, but maybe some others want to comment on it. The planning horizon that was mentioned in the report was the year 2040. And that's only 18 years away. And when you think of climate change, I think the sea level rise at that period was estimated to be 1.8 feet. But sea level rise, most of the projections show it accelerating as you go through the century. So how is the project considering the longer term future?
Yeah, so the information that I presented was mostly talking about 2040, and that is where we have some quantitative modeling that was done. So the EIR will also have a future discussion in terms of looking at 2070 and, you know, projected climate changes at 2070, and how we expect, you know, project to be operated and impacts of the project under those conditions. But in terms of, you know, the main thing is that, you know, further we go out, there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of climate change assumptions, and not only that, you know, the sea level rise assumptions, and then what the regulatory environment would be. So there's a lot of assumptions that we have to make. So doing a quantitative modeling has some challenges associated with that. So for that purposes, you know, there will be a qualitative discussion looking at period down the road, and talking about climate change and what this project does under those conditions.
Okay, yeah, that'll be interesting to see, because even with all the uncertainty, there's not a lot of reason to think things are going to get better. So that's a really important aspect of the impact of climate change on it. The other question dealt with water supply reliability. It's I think you were the one who mentioned it, Amardeep. Who is the water supply reliability for? In other words, what are the metrics you're using for the water supply reliability estimates?
So one of the metric would be, looking at total project yield and how that yield is expected to change with climate change and hydrology, and also sea level rise. So that's one of the things we're looking at is basically water supply for the State Water Project overall, and how it will change based on the existing conditions and moving forward with climate change and sea level rise, and whether we're able to maintain that down the road, addressing changing hydrology, seasonal pattern, sea level rise, how this project will be able to capture some excess flows that we can do right now to maintain that reliability.
What about reliable flows for the Delta itself?
Yeah, so definitely, the project itself will operate meeting all the existing, regulatory requirements, other, aquatics and other resources that are important in the Delta. So all, analysis includes that. So basically, just not the water supply, but just consideration in terms of different requirements and overall ecosystem, how this project will affect that.
Okay.
And just to add to that a little bit, I think that we are also looking at the different indicators that help us reflect on water quality and ecological parameters within the Delta. So we are presenting information in the EIR about flows at different locations and looking at changes as part of the impact analysis.
Okay.
Okay, Diane, then Obey.
Again, thanks very much for an informative presentation. I have one question that's a follow-up to Tom's question. I was again wondering about 2040. How many years between the completion of the construction of this project and 2040? How many years would the Delta Conveyance be operational? And I'm not sure who is the one to answer that.
I think that's probably for me. This is Carrie. So we are looking at a period where when the permitting is finished, we would need to finish final design and then land acquisition and then start construction. So we expect the project would be operational about the period of 2040.
Okay, so thanks for that. And then can I ask one more quick question, Tom? That's on a different topic. So I was really interested in the comments about the greenhouse gas emissions in the 2045 goal. Does that, the information we were provided, does that include the greenhouse gas emissions associated with construction, or are they mainly related to operations?
Yeah, great question. So the DWR greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan specifically covers operational emissions and has kind of a threshold for very large construction projects that would have been almost impossible to evaluate under the umbrella of a plan. And so obviously the conveyance project would fall outside of that that coverage under the plan. And so I think you'll find that the EIR has specific mitigation for all of the construction mitigation down to an insignificant threshold, a significance threshold, and then the operations are covered under the plan.
Thanks for that information.
Yep, thanks for the question.
Okay, Obey and then Joe.
Thank you. I'm the new member of the board, so I'm trying to learn all the topics that you have described. Good presentation, but I have two questions, one probably specific and more general. I was also wondering about what Tom and Dan asked about this 2045 being the planning horizon when you take out the construction and all that. And also we know that the greenhouse gas scenarios, they don't deviate too much until about later in the century, but that's something I'm hoping you will have in the report. So my specific question is, all this climate information keep changing. Now we have CMIP 6, for example, and I see that we are using CMIP 5, and then there are new sea level rise projections. So my question there is, are you required from CEQA to use certain scenarios or maybe ensembles or suites of climate output, or you just have to pick one? How to keep up with changing information is what I'm asking.
I can get started, and then Andrew, maybe you can add. So a couple of thoughts there. The first thing is that CEQA does define the existing conditions for the purpose of analysis as the time of the filing of the notice of preparation. So we filed that notice in January of 2020, and so that set the time for what we should look at. So that's part of the reason we're looking at CMIP 5 instead of 6, because that wasn't available when we started our analysis. And that really does set the timeline for what we're looking at as our baseline. So that's why when we're looking at current conditions, we are looking at operations compared to conditions in 2020, which I know is a little awkward when the project is not operational in 2020, but that's what CEQA asks us to do. But that's part of the reason that while it is not a specific requirement for us, we are also looking at 2040 because we want that information available to make good decisions, essentially. The other thing to keep in mind about the 2040 scenario that we're looking at is they are fairly conservative assumptions about what might happen. And yes, I do understand that sort of in the near term at 2040, most of the sea level rise are pretty similar. We are looking at a condition that we think could potentially cover a longer period depending on how much sea level rise occurs in any one time. And so I think with that, Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just like what you said, the sea level rise assumption of 1.8 feet by 2040 is extremely high for, that's really the outside of the possibility. That's the worst case scenario, according to the Ocean Protection Council. That's really more of a realistic scenario for kind of end of century 2070 time period is where we expect it to be at that level. And so this really is taking that conservative approach. And then I think that there'll be some additional analysis in the document that, just explores, a really bad, even worse sea level rise condition. Could the project still have an operational capability, or would it be a stranded asset at that point, to kind of inform the public about how this has been planned and how it could potentially still provide benefits even under very changed conditions in the Delta, with very high sea level.
And one more note, we're talking primarily about the draft EIR today and what we've analyzed there. But I did want to mention that on the design side, we have used a different approach to how we're looking at sea level rise for design. Because of the guidance from the Ocean Protection Council, we are looking at the H++ scenario in 2100 as part of the design feature. So we've looked at 10.2 feet of sea level rise plus a 200-year flood to establish water levels as part of the design process, because we really want to make sure that the design incorporates flexibility, that if we do experience that amount of sea level rise, the facility will still be usable.
All right, so maybe another issue is like you have to create a couple with sea level rise with the changes in the timing of rainfall in the basin, particularly for flooding issues. I assume there's a codependency there, but I'll get to that maybe later. But my broader question is, you are combining a lot of models, a lot of data, some empirical tools, and then scenarios which are uncertain. I was curious, how do you deal with the broader question of these compounding uncertainties, and when you compare alternatives, is there a formal mechanism to deal with uncertainties through this analysis process?
So I guess I can start that, and then if other folks have some things to add, that would be great. So I think that largely, we are again focused on the CEQA process, and largely the way that we look at uncertainties here is by making sure that we're always comparing to a baseline. So we understand that each model has many sets of uncertainties. But by looking at a baseline and an alternative run and using that comparison as the key point rather than absolute values, that helps quite a bit in addressing some of that uncertainty issue, because we're not trying to look at a specific number, but rather an indicator of change. Much of what we're looking at is an indicator and not a precise number. But if any other folks on the team have helpful information, that'd be great.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Joe, then Virginia.
Yeah, thank you for the very nice set of presentations. My question is with the USAs, the Corps of Engineers. They are also having an EIR, EIS, and I presume and I would expect that it will be very much different from what you are doing, or the outcome can be quite different, their assessment and your assessment. And my first question on that is that why are they involved? Because is that the normal protocol, or?
Okay, so the Corps is involved because they would have to permit this project both through a 404 permit for wetlands and waters and a 408 permit for changes to the flood protection system. So they need to evaluate the project as part of their process because they need NEPA compliance before determining if they can issue permits. So they're not a project proponent. They're not trying to implement this project. They're just evaluating it so that they can determine whether they should permit. So yes, it's a very different perspective than DWR's. So we are working on an environmental impact report under CEQA, and they're working on an environmental impact statement under NEPA. The requirements are similar, but not the same. So that was some of the material that I highlighted in the presentation. So it will be shorter. It has a little bit different focus. It does include some of the economic and environmental justice impacts that we're saying are not required under CEQA. They are included under NEPA. So it will be a little different, but it's a similar project and a similar process. So it's not completely different either.
Okay, Virginia.
Hey, well, I have several questions. One deals with what was just being talked about, the EIR and the EIS. I know more about the EIS in that it requires several alternative scenarios to be considered. And you mentioned the one of no action, but is there a way to try to be consistent in the scenarios considered? And is that useful?
So the Corps is, because they're a regulatory agency, they are pretty firm about making their own choices about their environmental document. So we've identified a suite of alternatives that we're analyzing in the EIR. It does include a no project alternative, and it does include different alignments and sizes for the proposed project and the potential alternatives. So we've certainly shared the information we're working on with the Corps, and I believe that they have identified a subset of that they think are alternatives from their perspective. So it's related but not identical because they're independent in their process.
Right, just makes it more complicated to review on our part.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to Obe's question about compounded uncertainties and the use of your many models. Are you attempting to be consistent with model assumptions? I'm thinking of the way the IPCC did it in terms of having, I think they called them scenarios that had a collection of assumptions, about population and climate and so forth. Is there an attempt to be consistent about these model assumptions, and are the model assumptions laid out clear enough for us to understand them?
So I am not a modeler, but I will start as the non-modeler, and Emerdeep, if you would like to add in, that would be great. So yes, we have laid out the modeling assumptions as part of a modeling appendix. We are consistent, calcium is applied pretty broadly across many, many water management projects. And so we do try to use a consistent set of assumptions. We have started using for this project calcium 3, but the assumptions and development of that have been made public through a joint effort with Reclamation and DWR. And we are trying to be consistent with the other water management projects that use calcium tools as a way to evaluate those projects. So yes, we are laying them out and we are consistent within our document, and we work to try to be consistent as long as it makes sense, unless there's a reason to deviate, and then we document that.
Okay, well, thank you. And then my final, was someone else going to say something? Okay, my final question is for the ag land, we heard about the economic effects, but are the non-economic effects of the ag land changes being considered, such as changes in uses of chemicals and potential subsidence effects?
Oops, here I am. There is an agricultural resources chapter that will be dealing with maybe some of those items you mentioned. Subsidence may be dealt with in the groundwater resources chapter. Maybe Carrie can correct me there. But yes, so the agricultural land effects are kind of split between two chapters, and maybe more on specific items like you mentioned. Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Hatchett is right. The groundwater chapter has subsidence and an analysis of subsidence there.
Okay, I'm next, and maybe my question sounds pretty naive, and it seems to me that when you're looking at the impact on these, there's sort of two components. One is the construction phase of the project, and the second is the operational phase. And it seems to me that there are potential impacts in all of your chapters, more or less, for each of those two quite different changes. And do the chapters consider both of those? Are they separated enough that we can look at how the operation is going to impact versus how the construction is going to impact something?
Yes, that's exactly how we're looking at it. So many chapters have an impact statement, and then first looks at construction, and then the operation and maintenance phase.
Okay, yeah, because it seems the operation, and I know that we've chatted before in terms of our other reviews, requires fairly explicit adaptive management approach and challenging at that. I think Lenny explained some of that, so that's it'd be interesting to read that. The second, the final, it's a minor question, is I noticed the models that went up, the only fish that was mentioned was a salmon. Is that going to be the go-to model, or do you have other fish being modeled as well?
This is Martin Greenwood. I can answer. There's probably more models than than you would like to hear about, but certainly, yeah, there's definitely more than just the salmon. So we're looking at a suite of different species.
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, Bob, then Tanya.
Great, thanks, Dave, and thanks to everyone for the presentations. They were very informative for me. I'm going to keep it simple because since we don't have a lot of information in front of us yet, but I am curious largely about one thing, and that has to do with how much water would actually be diverted in 2040 or 2045. If you could give me a round number in terms of acre feet that would be diverted, it would be appreciated.
Unfortunately, that's part of the modeling results that aren't quite ready to share yet. That will be included in the draft EIR, but that's we've really been focused on the methodology today. The results are not quite ready to share.
Okay, all right, I'll wait for that then, but thank you.
Okay, Tanya, and then Diane, and then we'll do a time check.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I just have a couple questions. I guess one is related to the water supply modeling, and I was just curious as to whether or not there is an accounting of how or if water demand changes will occur over the period of time that the conveyance project is in operation, or at least by 2040. Are there expectations that there will be shifts for demand for water exports from the project? And if so, does that take into account kind of changing, I guess, supply conditions from the water contractors, from the state water project, if they're, bringing more desal projects online or recycling projects? How does that get folded into the assessment of water supply, if at all?
Could you help with that one?
Yeah, so in the 2040 modeling that we have, the operations modeling, does take into account, future demands, both for Sacramento Valley and also, Delta, so for both ag and urban demands. So based on existing documents that we have. So basically, yeah, for both 2020 and 2040, we have, depending on the plan, horizon plan, we have within the model, different demands built in.
Thanks. Another just unrelated question, but more kind of about the process for public input. And to what extent will the report describe how or if public input has influenced kind of the planning scenarios or the different options, I guess, the alternatives that are being proposed at this point for the draft EIR?
So the draft EIR does include some summaries of that. I think that there is some more detailed information in terms of some of so there are a number of different efforts that have gone on to collect public information. And one of them is the public scoping process that we did for the CEQA document. And there is a summary of some of the key information and how we've incorporated it in the EIR, as well as the full scoping report is included as an appendix. But there are some other documents that if that's something you're interested in, may also be interesting for you to take a look at. One of the other major processes that we went through is that the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority implemented a stakeholder engagement committee to get input on ways to reduce effects to communities, particularly as part of the design process. And they've had some summary presentations that they've posted on their website that does have a pretty good overview of the design changes that they made as a result of that process.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, Diane.
Thanks again. One question I had is in my effort to envision this report and looking at the chapter titles, I was wondering about, is there a variable geographic scope of the different chapters? Will fish and aquatic resources mainly be about the Delta and not so much about fish and aquatic resources further south, or will it be fish and aquatic resources in the Delta area and in the area where the conveyance project is being built, which extends beyond the Delta, if I understand correctly? Do you see what I'm saying? And I was wondering about, vibration and noise. Is that predominantly in terms of the construction phase? So will we have variable geographic scope for these different chapters?
And we define that at the beginning of each chapter. So one of the first things in each chapter is it typically includes a map. And so we define the project area, which is where the project would be implemented, but then the study area for that resource. And it does vary depending on the resource and the type of impacts that it might experience.
Okay, let me do a time check first. Edmund, how many public comments do we have on this topic?
We just have one written comment, but as a reminder, if you have a public comment, make sure to do a raised hand on Zoom. Thank you.
Okay, Tom, then Bob.
Okay. One thing that would be helpful for us to know is how equal are these chapters if we're going to be reviewing them and dividing them up among the group? Is there a lot of variation between the depth in chapters, or are they more or less equally balanced?
So each chapter, the way that we get that CEQA provides direction is that the chapter should be sort of commensurate to it should be as long as needed to describe the impacts, for lack of a better way to put it. So yes, the length varies not insubstantially. So I did send a list to Edmund. And Edmund, have you made that available to the ISB members?
Yes, that handout is public and posted.
Okay, so it does include for each chapter. Some of them, for example, the terrestrial biology chapter is quite a bit longer than some of the others because there's a lot to discuss there. So they do vary by chapter.
Okay, Edmund, I haven't seen the one with the pages. I saw the list of chapters. But...
Okay, I'll go ahead and resend it, but it's also on the web right now.
Okay.
I sent it to Edmund this morning, so it is a late breaking arrival.
Okay, Bob.
I have a question about flooding and how the report would treat flood. And I'm especially interested, does the report at all address the positive aspects of flooding? Ecologically, flooding is probably one of the most important characteristics that you have in terms of shaping ecosystem processes. Does the report directly address how this project would impact the positive aspects of flood regimes?
Sorry, slow to unmute. That's an interesting question. So I think that because we're really focused on a change, what we're looking at is looking at existing conditions and whether the project that we're considering has the potential to worsen those conditions. We're not really, one of our project objectives isn't really to provide increased flooding for habitat. So I don't think that we're necessarily looking for that opportunity. We do have an analysis of how flooding will change, but I don't know that we are sort of trying to capitalize on that opportunity because it is outside of our project objectives.
I was really thinking about, I guess maybe you're doing it already. Well, we'll see when the report arrives, but in terms of losses of ecological attributes, because the peak, a lot of the waters in the peak flood are being harvested or sequestered and moved in a non-traditional way through the Delta. So anyway, I'll wait for the report, but it's one thing that I'm particularly interested in is how this project would impact flood regimes. So anyway, thank you.
Looks like Karla might have something to add there.
Yeah, and Lenny Grimaldo can also kind of step in as our fisheries expert. That is a really interesting question. And Mr. Nemeth, I think about it in this way. The state is doing a lot of work to actually reactivate floodplains for their ecological purpose. And that is also true, particularly in the Yolo bypass, which is outside of the legal delta, but certainly has a reactivation of that floodplain for fishery purposes, certainly has downstream ecological benefit that's really important. And so as we think about this project and how this project would operate, we definitely want to preserve the positive effects of floodplain restoration projects that will be coming online over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. And in fact, we're actually breaking ground on a very long in the works floodplain project on the Yola bypass really in the next 2 weeks. So that's how I think about the interrelationship of this project to the ecological benefits of flooding. I don't know, Lenny, if you want to add a little bit there.
Yeah, just to add to the floodplain piece is that when I think of flooding, I think of all the available habitat that becomes accessible, not just on the floodplains, but in tidal marshes as well. We get an activation of low salinity habitat that promotes species spawning downstream in the Delta in our project area. So for me, I think of all the portfolio of actions that occur with flooding and what we're doing to promote those things. And these things are connected because we got to get fish off the floodplains and into the tidal marshes as they move to the ocean. So to me, I think it's about connecting that bridge concept from upstream to downstream with the flooding concept.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess I also think about it in terms of not only, the biological responses, but the biogeochemical responses and the physical responses to flooding. And if you're harvesting the peak of a flood, you're actually taking away, potentially taking away one of the main drivers for setting up the system for many years to come. So anyway, I look forward to reading how you've addressed this, in the report. I think it'll make for some interesting discussions a little bit later on. Thank you.
Okay, Joe.
First, I apologize. I got cut off. There's a weather system passing by, and when I am speaking, it has to come out and act up. So I apologize. My question here is that about the socioeconomic analysis, usually you don't have to do it. That's what I kind of understand. But you guys did the environmental justice, socioeconomic analysis, and you reached out to about 1,500 people. And what was the response rate? I mean, the analysis, is that representative of the Delta impacted communities, or all depend on how much response rate you got? Is that analysis done in this report, that type of analysis?
Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Julian.
So I'll start and then you jump in. So the environmental justice report was sent out to as many people as we could in the Delta. We heard back from 2,117 people. Of the 2,117 people, 540 of them were characterized as Delta disadvantaged people. And we then looked at who lived, of the people who responded, how many lived in the Delta, how many were disadvantaged, how many worked in the Delta, disadvantaged, et cetera. There's what, like 500,000 people or something in the Delta. We weren't trying to get a representative sample. What we were trying to find out was from the disadvantaged and the different language communities, what were their preferences, what were their special places, and what were their views on the proposal so far. Now we've used that information from the survey now to figure out where should we go and how should we go to different places for for them to learn about the project and for them to learn whether or not the project might affect them and how to provide input. And so that's where you get the number of 1,500 people that we've done outreach to. And as you could see in that slide, we've used as many ways as we could think of and as much guidance as we got from our community-based organizations and our Delta leaders on how to do that outreach and how to, in what languages and in what way in different places. So I think I'm happy to answer any more questions about the survey and the outreach, but our outreach has really been trying to focus. There's other outreach that's happening to people in the Delta, but what we've been really concerned about is making sure that we get to the those different language groups and the people who are working 24/7 who don't know that there might be a conveyance project near them, or might want to know about jobs, or might want to know about any other impacts. So that's what we've been focused on with the outreach.
That's very impressive. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, Obe. You're still on mute.
Yep, thank you. Actually, I'm interested in the future conditions, how you are looking at due to climate change. In particular, this interoperability of these models, the temporal scales of these models. Years ago when I looked at calcium, it was like a monthly model. I don't know if it is still a monthly model or not. So I was wondering how you account for this, in the future you have this rain happening more frequently than snow, and there's a time lag, and whether the upstream storage areas can store that rapid runoff coming into the system, whether that will result in more flooding in Delta, which might threaten the safety of the levees, for example. So do you have like different timescales of operations of these models that allows you to address all the way from flooding to water supply reliability, which you might be able to do that with a higher or coarser temporal resolution? It's kind of a high level question, the adequacy of the system of models and their interoperability. And
So I'd like to hand that over to Emerdy, but just one framing thought before I do that. What we're doing with our modeling effort is trying to look at the potential effects of the Delta Conveyance Project. There will be many, many effects of climate change that we're not looking at specifically here. Looking at what climate change could do to the environment is a very different type of study and process, and really one that the Delta Stewardship Council is leading the way on. But Emerdy, maybe you could provide more detail about what we did.
Yeah, so really calcium 3 is a monthly time step model, so that hasn't changed. So and definitely, that is a limitation or the data that we have, best available tool. So, but then there is some other, downstream models like DSM-2, which can, simulate in a 15-minute time step in terms of hydrodynamics in the delta. But in terms of calcium and system operations and upstream hydrology, it is a monthly model.
just to follow up, Kerry, so what is the role of groundwater modeling if you're looking at? Is that downstream of Delta in San Joaquin Valley or somewhere else? Or?
We're using groundwater models within the project area to look at a number of things. One of them is that we're looking at whether the facilities have the potential to disrupt groundwater movement. We're looking at whether diverting water out of the river during times of high flow would have a potential to substantially affect groundwater recharge, sort of groundwater surface water interaction. So those types of changes to groundwater.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Jody, still have your hand up? Okay, I guess not. So any other questions? Okay, for the public comment, I just want to point out to folks, remind folks that we did receive, I think it was 584 public comments from the Sierra Club titled "The Delta Conveyance Project is Not a Solution to Drought and Climate Change." And Edmund, we have one more written comment. I presume that will be distributed to the board and posted.
This one is to be read out loud, and we also have 2 oral public comments.
Okay, so why don't you start with we'll ask the oral commenters to limit themselves to 3 minutes. And Edmund, do you want to read that one first?
Yeah, in addition to the number has continued to increase, it's actually at 854 now in terms of the individual comment letters.
854, okay.
All right, so this this written comment is from Barbara Ravines from the Sierra Nevada group, Sierra Club. The comment is, this project is an environmental mistake and should not be under consideration. We need to adapt to climate change and not try to mitigate large agriculture's inappropriate use of California land. We live in an arid state and cannot mitigate our way out of it. So that concludes that written comment. And then we'll go over to our oral comments. So we'll first have Deirdre Desjardins, then we'll go to Molly Colton, Before providing your public comment, please state your name and affiliation if applicable, and you'll be unmuted shortly. Thank you.
It's Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I just wanted to say that my understanding of the role of the Delta Independent Science Board, they were specifically mandated to consult with the Department of Water Resources, was mandated to consult with Independent Science Board on development of the project. And the board declared that consultation finished in 2017, when they updated their guidelines, and it was at the request of the Delta Stewardship Council. And I'd really like to know why the council requested that, and if it was at the instigation of DWR, because there is a history of the Delta Independent Science Board raising very serious questions about saying, you know, the treatment of climate science isn't adequate. And, you know, if you're not adequately considering it, it's dangerous. And I think this evaluation at 2040, there's a very real question if it meets the requirements of the Delta Reform Act, which, you know, you're looking at best available science. In best available science, when you're designing water supply for 27 million people, is not only look at sea level rise at 2040. The project has a much longer design lifetime than that. And you should know that there were specifications as part of the engineering contract with the Design and Construction Authority, the Joint Powers Agreement, that the project was going to be designed to withstand maximum considered earthquake in the Delta. That was rescinded, and it was also going to be designed to have a 100-year lifetime, and that was rescinded. And so I'm happy to hear that there's been some consideration of extreme sea level rise, which will be seen in the lifetime of the project, maybe not within 60 years, maybe not by 2100, but sometime after that, we're going to see 10 feet of sea level rise. So I'm just very concerned that, the initial project, they were looking at 2060, which was about, kind of midterm operations, and that just isn't being looked at all. And that's when things get really difficult for the Delta, for the project, and there start being real conflicts. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deidre. It is our intent to review this document as we expressed in our April 17th, 2020 memo to the Department of Water Resources, as this was a continuation of our responsibilities. The next public comment?
The next one is from Molly. Molly, you have the ability to unmute your microphone, but I also want to note that we also have another public comment. And if you do have a public comment, please be sure to raise your hand via Zoom. So Molly, please provide your public comment now. Thank you.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hello, members of the Delta Independent Science Board. My name is Molly Colton. I'm an organizer with Sierra Club California, representing nearly 500,000 members and supporters statewide. It's no secret that the Sierra Club opposes the Delta Tunnel project and every previous iteration of it. The Department of Water Resources argues that this project is needed due to climate change and seismic risks. But where is that water supposed to come from? The small rivers and tributaries that flow into the Sacramento River are fed by snowmelt from the northern Sierra Nevada, which recent reports say could disappear in 25 years. In fact, according to the Delta Stewardship Council's own Delta Adapt study last year, I quote, "Delta water exports will be less reliable in the future. Climate change will reduce Delta exports in all year types, but impacts will be greater in dry years. Climate change will also reduce reservoir storage in all years, meaning less water can be carried over from one year to the next, increasing the water supply system's vulnerability to droughts and impacts when they occur. End quote. Historic die-offs of winter run Chinook salmon are already happening in the Sacramento River because of high temperatures due to climate change and drought. Further depleting these necessary flows from the Sacramento will only make this issue worse. Regarding the seismic risk, even if the tunnel were built, reliability would still be uncertain because the single tunnel does not address earthquake vulnerabilities in existing infrastructure. Any water exported through the single tunnel would eventually flow to and through existing water redistribution systems in the southern San Joaquin Valley and Southern California regions owned and operated by either state, cities, or local water agencies. Much of this infrastructure is at a greater risk of earthquake damage than Delta levees for reasons ranging from geographic location to negligent maintenance and upkeep. We need a common sense approach that includes strengthening the Delta levees and making them more resilient to seismic risks and sea level rise. At the end of the day, environmental groups just want state agencies to use the best available science to evaluate these projects. And the science is loud and clear that the Delta is already in trouble, and the Delta Tunnel will only make things worse. Thank you for your time, and good luck reviewing the EIR. We'll all need it.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Edmund, who's next?
The last one's from OSHA, Missouri. OSHA, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. OSHA Reserve, and I'm speaking on behalf of local agencies of the North Delta, which is a coalition of reclamation and water districts in the Northern Delta. And I have been working on Delta tunnel and canal related issues since 2008, advocating for alternatives like those that Ms. Colton was referring to. I guess in listening to the presentation today, I'm disappointed with the amount of information that DWR is able to give your board to think about its review. And I'm concerned that even when you receive the draft EIR and the draft EIS, that it won't include the type of information you would need in order to do a full scientific review and to provide feedback as your board is intending. And in particular, I'm concerned about the lack of information that appears will be included in the draft EIR regarding operations. And that was a major, for those of you who are a little newer to this saga, that was a major problem with the EIR previously for the water fix and BDCP. It also was a major issue in the water board water rights hearings, that there was this huge range of conditions, which they called boundary 1 and boundary 2, that the project could supposedly operate under. And so there was like what should be a simple question, and maybe DWR isn't prepared to answer it today, that Mr. Brandt or maybe Bob, Mr. Neiman asked, is how much water would it divert? Seems like a good question that should be able to be answered, and yet you didn't hear an answer to that. I think the answer that you'll see is that DWR wants to have a wide range of operational flexibility, and that there won't be a specific operations plan, which makes a huge difference to all the environmental impacts and also to the impacts in Delta. You also didn't get an answer about what about water supplies for whom. It's very important to water users within the Delta who use the water for municipal, agricultural, and domestic and recreational uses, that our water quality be protected as well. And it's not clear that that's going to be analyzed. Last point is, under NEPA, we don't even have a NEPA plan for operations. And so that also is going to constrict your review, because as was explained previously, NEPA has a little bit different approach to the analysis, and there's not even a plan for how to analyze operations under that legal structure. So sounds like, I'll conclude very briefly, if you don't mind. It sounds like DWR still needs to go back to the drawing board and do some more work before it would be ready to present these documents to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments, Edmund?
There are no additional comments. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of our guests today and for the information they provided. We are looking forward to looking at this. We hope that I know you don't want to tie yourself down to a date, but even if you could tie yourself down to a quasi week for us at some stage, the sooner the better for us. And part of it is that in terms of our planning, it is our hope that we would have at least one of our face-to-face meetings provide an opportunity where we could have a small group meetings and discuss and debate the various science elements of the reports. So as soon as we know that, we can begin to schedule that at our next face-to-face meetings. So any other questions before we move on? Okay, well, thank you very much again for attending. Hopefully we can bring you back if we need to. Okay, we're not too far behind schedule to do, what's the board's sense? So we want to take a 5 or 10 minute break? Okay, I see a couple of heads nodding, so let's break for just 10 minutes, and we'll reconvene again about 4:18. Yeah. So let's reconvene. We're moving on to item 3 on our agenda, which is really for us to come up with a work plan for how to approach this review. I want to remind people that our job is to review the science of the EIR, and I think that what we'd like to talk about today is to maybe we could look at some of the questions that they raised in terms of what they would like to hear from us. At one stage, I was told we might get some guidance from the Stewardship Council, but we haven't received any guidance yet. We will want to discuss the general chapter assignments and, more importantly, talk about how we're going to move forward on this, and whether another topic is whether or not we should consider some sort of a template for each of the chapter reviews. We have have done that in the past, so each chapter is kind of reviewed, what are the key points, what's missing, etc. Some sort of a template that we might consider moving forward with. Before we, well, let's go to the questions before. I had a few more things, but let's go. It looks like we got some urgent questions. First, Bob.
Thanks, Steve. Oops. There we go. Thanks, Steve. I'm just curious, will we have an opportunity to receive presentations from other groups or other individuals about scientific issues surrounding the conveyance project?
You mean those that wrote the chapters or other external reviewers?
External reviewers. For example, there's a number of issues raised, well, by many groups and many others. It would be I feel it would be useful to hear about some of the science that that would support various viewpoints, and I would guess between USGS and some other agencies, and perhaps even some folks at the universities, that they perhaps have some science-based evidence that it would be useful for us to hear about. Anyway, it's out of curiosity more than anything, if we just have an opportunity to hear from other folks.
Yeah, I think it's something we can discuss, but oftentimes we need to be a little careful about hearing from folks that have particular viewpoint on whether or not this ought to be done in the science that they're, you know, that it has to be sort of independent, objective kind of a science. But mostly, I think we could call in folks to talk about immediate reaction is about topics. If there's a topic about water quality modeling in the you know, and get a brief background that would tell us about the various water quality models as an example, and provide that sort of basis of information that we could then use from.
Well, it certainly would have to be from a, you know, it would have to be credible. I wouldn't want to hear from folks that have one opinion or another as to whether the project should go ahead, but from folks that could give us factual background information.
Yeah, and of course, our review has to be an evaluation, like it would be in any peer review, looking at the evaluation of the science that's being used in the document.
Right.
Laurel? Laurel, you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't usually use my headphones, but I've got the phone and computer going in different places. I did just want to clarify what the council will be providing, since it sounded like that was a question. The council will be providing the board on our best available science procedure for evaluation of the document. And as part of that discussion, there will be some broad topics presented to the board as things that are particularly relevant or particularly of interest for the council's evaluation. So the council is not going to be providing the ISB with suggested charge questions, but we're hoping to provide you more insight into the process that we use to make an evaluation.
Okay, because I had thought that they might be doing that based on other conversations, but that's okay. That's just good to know. I'm going to talk about best available science in a minute. Diana, do you have a quick question?
I have a quick question. So throughout the presentation, we were told that the DWR wasn't required under the legislation to do this and that, but then there's such as environmental justice, but there is a section, or there will be a section in the report about environmental justice. Will we be reviewing the science of those chapters that are not apparently required? You see what I'm saying? Or will, you know, we review it, but since they didn't have to do it, it won't really matter what we say anyway.
It's a good question. I felt fuzzy about that too, and I really think that's up for us to decide, and it's a matter of I don't know if they're doing science and it's part of their environmental impact report. To me, it's part of our purview. You know, whether or not they were required to include that chapter is we're reviewing the environmental impact report.
But don't we first have to know if it's illegal? I mean, if it's unenforceable and it doesn't matter, then.
I don't know, Tanya?
Well, these are impacts that are included to inform the policy decisions that will be made, and not simply by the fact that if CEQA doesn't require it to be included, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be reviewing it, that it's not important. And I would say that a lot of those components that are not required are dealing with social and economic impacts. And I think those are critical for us to review to the extent that we can, the extent that we have the capacity. And I think they will be important in making policy decisions. So I would say yes.
Okay, so it sounds like we will be reviewing those, assuming we get volunteers to review those. So before we dive into this a little bit, we're trying to think about guidance and so forth. And I know the topic of best available science has come up. It's come up in it's come up in most of the public comments we've received. It's also, I think, part of Jay's letter that he sent a few meetings ago. And what I sent around today was had Edmund send around was a Appendix 1A of the Delta Plan, which defines what best available science is. And so it's 3 pages long. You should have a look at that because in a sense that kind of is an overall guidance for us in general because it's part of the Delta Science Plan. I think Karen would like to give us a little bit more background on that and has a few slides for us. Karen?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Edmund can go ahead and bring up my slides, and this is part of the Delta Plan. So the Delta Plan contains a framework on best available science. I'm sorry, I got so excited, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Karen Kafitz, and I'm the Adaptive Management Program Manager for the Delta Stewardship Council. So I'm here to provide you with an overview of the Delta Plan's best available science framework. The Independent Science Board is responsible for identifying and agreeing upon your own approach to reviewing the Conveyance Project EIR-EIS, which is the conversation that you're starting today. And we hope that the Delta Plan framework can be useful to you as you consider how you want to approach your review of the scientific basis, as Tanya was saying, the scientific basis of the policy decisions that are being made for this project. So the content that I'll cover on the next 2 slides are directly out of the Delta Plan's Appendix 1A, which will be, sounds like was already circulated to members and will be posted online as a meeting material for your reference. This slide presentation will also be posted online after the meeting for the reference of the board and the public. Next slide, Edmund. Okay, so I've got a teeny tiny picture of criteria here. Don't worry, I'm gonna talk about what those are, so don't try and read the ant type. But what Appendix 1A on best available science in the Delta Plan does is it describes guidelines and criteria for defining and assessing best available science. The criteria that were adopted by the Delta Plan are adapted from the National Research Council criteria. And the guidance that's provided requires that proposed actions in the Delta, such as the Conveyance Project, but many other types of actions as well, be consistent with these guidelines, be consistent with these 6 criteria, and that they document their scientific rationale for applying the criteria. The guidelines in Appendix 1A also recognize that the level of technical information included in these justifications is variable and is relative to the scale, scope, and nature of the proposed action. So that's just a little bit of context I wanted to provide for you about how we look at these criteria. And on my next slide, I'll go into the criteria themselves. So Edmund, please advance. So these are the 6 criteria that are articulated in that table, and I'm not showing the full text, so I do refer board members and the public to review the full text of these for more context and specificity. But this just gives a high-level overview of what these different criteria mean. So relevance is ensuring that the science being cited by the project is germane to the Delta and the components that are being affected by the project. For example, a study being cited as reference is drawn from scientific literature on the Delta, if there is such a study in the Delta, or if there is not Delta-specific literature, that studies are being drawn from a comparable estuarine system or whatever the next closest comparable system is. So relevance is having that literature be as relevant as possible to the specific topics and area. Inclusiveness means that there's a thorough review across relevant disciplines and that research papers are not cherry-picked to support a specific conclusion at the exclusion of other reputable and peer-reviewed scientific contributions. For example, citing literature on both sides of an area of scientific uncertainty would meet the criterion of inclusiveness. Objectivity is ensuring that data and analyses adhere to scientific methods and do not include non-scientific influences. That is to say that decisions are based on rigorously tested hypotheses and verifiable facts determined by observation and experiment. Transparency and openness refers to the sources and methods being clearly identified and accessible for the public to review. Analytical limitations and uncertainties should also be clearly identified and explained. For example, a modeling study to support the project that clearly explains how the model parameters were derived and what the known limitations are of the model. The timeliness criterion is about ensuring that scientific information used as a basis for decision-making in the project is timely and applicable to current situations. For example, utilizing the most recent sea level rise estimates to evaluate potential future performance of the project or its vulnerabilities. And then peer review, this concept as it's described in the criterion table applies both to the scientific analyses that are used as a basis and also the analyses that are performed for the project. For example, the literature or the studies that are being referenced are published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and novel analyses such as modeling for predicting project outcomes has been subject to independent external review. So those are the 6 criteria summarized. There's certainly more, like I said, to read into that by going into the details. So I would direct you to reading that 3-page appendix. Edmund, next slide. So as we were just talking about a second ago, we have identified some topical areas of interest to the council. In your review of the Conveyance EIR-EIS, we expect that you'll be interested in analyzing the scientific basis underlying project decisions across a variety of topic areas. What we've listed on this slide are just topical areas that are particularly relevant to the council's analysis. And to Steve's point earlier in response to Bob's question, other interest groups will likely have additional topic areas that they could suggest to you to consider for your review. And we expect that the board will also identify topical areas beyond what we've listed here and beyond what the stakeholders are interested in. So this is just to cue you into what our interests are, but there are many different areas that you can focus your review on. So I'm not going to read through the list here, but I'll leave this slide up and ask if board members have any questions.
Okay, seeing none, thanks, Karen. In the past, what we've done is we, of course, had small groups of people take the lead. Oh, Joe, do you have a question?
Just a quick question. Karen, that most of the EIR I was dealing with one past few months, you also have remediation. You know, you have a question, you have a problem, and then you have remediation. And that remediation also based on science. If there are some issues like that, should be addressed at the remediation part also.
So I think what you're talking about is mitigation measures.
Mitigation, yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so when the project identifies that there's going to be an impact on a particular environmental resource, they suggest mitigation measures. And I'll say when the council does our review and our analysis of a project, we do also look at the scientific basis for those mitigation measures. So there are some types of mitigation measures that are formulaic. They're prescribed by particular environmental laws and say, you know, if you have X acres of impact on this species, you need to do Y acres of mitigation. So some of it is very formulaic. Some of it is novel and really tailored to the specific project. And so it's that second type that we're especially digging into the scientific basis for why the project proponent believes that a specific mitigation will ameliorate negative effects on that resource that is impacted. Good question, thank you.
So it seems to me when I think about an overall framework for our review, I'm still stuck in this idea that there's two things being done. One is the construction and all of its associated things, and the second component is the operation. As one of the public commenters pointed out, is we were in the original BCP as well as in the water fix, we're very concerned about the operational aspect of it, because that's the area that is more likely to have, will have different sorts of impact, particularly in the biological and ecological side in general, but other things as well. And I think that it seems to be a natural divide, and one could think about writing a review. It says, okay, here's our review of the science related to the construction. Here's our review related to the operations, because the operations is the one that, in many respects, that deals specifically with the adaptive management component of it, which is another area of major emphasis that we that really is part of anything that goes on in the Delta, but it's also very much a part of what we brought up in our last reviews. So that's one way to cut it. We also had some review comments that related to the format, to the simplicity of it, to the summary chapters and things like that, that also could be done. Each of these could be done in each of the chapters. So anyway, we divided it up into small group assignments, and they worked together to review the chapters, and then we compiled that information and began broader discussions on common themes that were throughout the document, but also things that were rose to the surface of critical concerns or critical issues or things like that. I'm open to ideas on where we go from here. We have quasi chapter assignments prior to seeing page numbers, and I know we're trying to do something that is we don't really know what the content is. Those of us who have done it before have a pretty good idea what the content is. The second thing is we have this moving 3-month window, 90-day window of when we're going to do this. It seems that we could take advantage of our at least one of our face-to-face meetings to spend some serious time sitting down and discussing and debating these, either on chapter by chapter basis or another way to cut it. But the way it works out, we could only do one of those depending on when that 90-day period starts. Any other thoughts? Where do we go from here? And yes, Lisa.
Well, I did it again. It's so hard to remember not to unmute. I like some of these topic areas that Karen raised. It does seem to me, though, that we don't want to be too formulaic, given that we have a lot of content to cover, right? And there might not be a point in discussing transparency if they've just done a good job, right? And we don't have to just go around praising things. We want to bring up, concerns. Of course, we're going to praise good things too, but I guess I'm thinking that our template needs to incorporate some of what we heard today, but I think that some questions were raised during the presentation about thinking through adequacy, and there was an interesting, I'm trying to word this properly. It's not our job to say, should this project go forward or not, but it is our job to say these alternatives cover a good scope. And so that's the kind of thing I'm wondering, where does that fit into the chapter by chapter approach, in terms of, we also need to say they looked at ways to mitigate harms, and Tanya brought up an issue related to this too. Do we need kind of an overarching bit that covers these bigger issues and then get into the chapter by chapter? That's my question.
I'm not sure on the overarching issue, did they cover enough alternatives? I'm not sure we're into that. I think we can point out what the limitations of the alternatives covered are, but I don't know that we want to get into the phase of start proposing new alternatives, because so let me just read a little bit more. I encourage you again to look at the best available science. There are some there's a lot of ways to cut this, but one of the 5 bullets they say you should ask, for example, in each chapter, well-stated objectives, a clear conceptual or mathematical model, a good experimental design with standardized methods for data collection, statistical rigor and sound logic for analysis and interpretation, and clear documentation of methods, results, and conclusions. And then the science is understandable, clearly outlined assumptions and limitations. So there's some language like that that might be good guidance. It also talks about the sources of scientific information in terms of peer review publications versus, expert opinion and things like that. So I think there are some nuggets in there that are just kind of standard every time you review a manuscript or a proposal. Those kind of things are part and parcel of the guidance you get. Yes, Obey, and then Joe.
Yeah, real quickly, I would like some clarity on basically, the spatial scope of the issues that we are going to address in our review. The reason I'm saying this, several times during the presentation today, they said, we are only looking at the effect of this project but project on what issues? Is that through the entire system, all the way from north to south, or is that within the Delta? Is that something that has been discussed already? What are things you are going to touch and what are things you are going to comment on, or is it open?
I don't know. I would hope it would be within the EIR that they would say we are addressing the issue over this time and space scale, and here's the results based on that.
Right.
I would think that would be hopefully pretty
Okay, so
clear.
it will be hopefully in the report, what is the scope of the EIR?
Yes, I would think so. Joe?
Yeah, last time, Steve, if you remember that we had a little bit of a guidance on the write-up. We had a small introduction and then we had different sections. It was maximum 2 pages, if I remember, each section we dedicated to. So if we can come up with a little bit of guidance, so when we are writing the reports, that will be quite useful. So everything is consistent, so you don't have to do any editing later on. We can put together the whole thing very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's what we are looking for, some sort of we called it a template. We tried to resurrect what we did before, and it was pretty vague in terms of what we could find on that. But we can continue to try and see what we did. We did, of course, 2 major reviews. And the first one, our review was very lengthy, and we also had areas where there were the general overarching review, but then it was also individual comments on individual chapters, and I'm not sure we want to go into that detail, but so yes, I think we should put up some sort of a thing like that, and we need ideas for it. Virginia, and then Bob.
So I have several comments. I think guidance is useful, 2 pages, but it's guidance, so we can go beyond it if we need to. And I think a template is useful, but again, we might have a topic that's just called other, so that we feel like we could put in other things like this. And in regard to previous questions, chapter 2 is project objectives, purpose, and need. And there, I think they must talk about the scale, time, and space, as well as what they're going to look at. And I think that's a point at which we do talk about the adequacy of this and if the scope is appropriate, just like we do the other chapters. And similarly, chapter 4 is about description of the proposed project and alternatives. To me, it seems like if there are alternatives that would make sense that aren't even mentioned in that chapter, that maybe we should mention them here. And so to me, although there, gosh, how many chapters? 35 chapters. If we do have that kind of organization for each of these, it seems appropriate to me. And I've just gone through developing with others, a 20-page response to an EIS that's in Tennessee, very different. But looking at these chapters, I could see that the topics we brought up were also the same projects, the same topics we brought up in that EIS. So it looks to me like it's, in terms of topics, pretty well covered.
Yeah, and I think it probably would not hurt to go back and look at our review of the original BDCP. Again, it's very, very lengthy, but I think in there, I mean, really, it's many of the same sort of types of issues, science issues that are being dealt with. And if we said, well, they weren't using the right bioenergetics models on species A and B, clearly I would go back and look and say, well, are they doing it now in this report? And I think that might help individual chapter writers to at least have something to begin to look at and see if they're doing it that way. So Tanya?
Yeah, I think Virginia may have said this already, but I want to highlight the point because it ties into Lisa's comment earlier and Obe's comment as well. And that is, you know, the scale and scope of the impacts that were reviewed may be set in the EIR or a certain time period or a certain geographic scope, and we can review the science within that scale and scope and time period. But if we determine that there's science that might be important to consider that is outside of that time period or outside of that geographic scope, that's something that should be on the table for assessing. So, you know, I think that there's some limitations that we have in terms of we can't go out and, you know, look at all possible alternatives that weren't considered, obviously, but I do think that there's reason for us to be paying attention to, you know, what might be missing from the approach that was taken, whether it's, you know, was this the right time period or was this the right kind of geographic scope to look at the impacts?
Okay, Joe, and then Virginia.
Yeah, I think the scale, most of the time when you look at the chapter, if I remember correctly, and also my recent experience, that the scale automatically comes up. For example, if you have machinery working and the PM10 particulate matter comes up, then its scope is that area, the environment impact. When you consider the carbon dioxide, so basically that kind of a global impact on the environment by this project, and that basically has to be somewhat evaluated in that context. When you look at the pollution, for water pollution, how long it goes and how far it goes and what time periods it persists. So that usually comes up during the write-up and their own EIR, because different problems have different time scales type things. So kind of it gives you some guidance when you're doing it. I think it's a very important issue.
Okay, Virginia.
And I would agree with Joe to the extent under, you know, if we have a topic of appropriateness for each chapter, we could add, you know, appropriate time scale, spatial scale, and tools. And that brings up the question that I was going to raise. I think the really hard part is going to be when there isn't good science available to address some of these topics. And really bring that up because of this other EIS I just mentioned that we sent in comments yesterday. There wasn't science available to address some of the things that they're going to do. And as scientists, in that case, we didn't feel comfortable telling them to move ahead when we don't know what the implications are. And so maybe as a group, that's one of the things we need to talk about, what to do when there isn't good science.
Okay, Diane.
Yeah, I was wondering about chapter 30. Its heading is climate change. And that seemed to be kind of an overarching theme. And even for some of these issues like water supply, flood protection, all of these other topics. And so I'm wondering, you know, why is that chapter 30 and is what's going to be in that? So it's hard to know how climate change will be assessing their climate change models in response to that climate change chapter, or will we be assessing how considerations of climate change are influencing the agricultural resources, assessing the science that went behind agricultural resources? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I wish I knew. Any other thoughts or ideas on our next steps? Okay. Anybody want to join a small committee to kind of think about putting together some guidance or a template, no more than one page, something that can be put forward to the group as a think about? It's hard to do because we don't have the document, but in terms of some of the ways, things to consider, or something we can use as a guidance to evaluating the chapters. Okay, so Jay clearly volunteered, and I think Tom is gone, so he's on the list. And anyone
I
else?
nominate Virginia because she's done this before. I have no idea.
All right, that's 3. That should, you know, and we've done it before. Jay's done it before, and Jay did put together if you recall, in May, he put together evaluating best available science for Delta Conveyance proposals, and he actually had a number of things in there that we ought to consider in terms of this evaluation as well. And so that's why I'm putting him on there. He can always deny, but
well, as long as Virginia will do it and Jay will do it, I'd be happy to help. But I think either Virginia or Jay would need to take the lead on the first draft.
Oh, not me. I was going to volunteer to review. I think Jay needs to take it because we can build on what you've done. He can build on what the committee, has previously done.
Yeah, the idea is to put just a one-page thing together. We can gather, Edmund and I and others can gather what we've done in the past, you know, and as to use as guidance to what we ought to do in the future. I guarantee you we're not going to get this by July 1st, so we have our July meeting where we'll have some time to discuss this. We'll put it on the agenda and discuss this further, see if we've had any more chance to think about how to go forward. And it may all be thrown out the window once we see the first draft. We just might say this is not going to work. But I'm sensing that we do want to have something as guidance, and we do want to do each chapter with at least a minimum bulleted things to look at, so we can write those up. And anything else we can do ahead of time to get ready? I do encourage folks to look. I shouldn't even say this, but skim read very quickly our BDCP report. You already have the report of the water fix, which has some of the basic elements in it, but the BDCP report, I have a sense it's going to be closer to something like this in terms of the types of individual chapter considerations. So that would be worth having a skim read to get yourself fixed. Joe.
Yes, Steve, I'll work with Jay, if Jay can take the lead. I work with him putting together something so that the committee can have a look at it and update it.
Okay, that sounds good. And we'll send meaning Edmund, will send you some of the previous sorts of things that we've done before in terms of our guidance for the EIRs. And then
Another caveat is that before July 1st, I cannot do anything, but it's after July 1st, right? You need that.
no, I think we by our next meeting would be fine. And then which is 10th and 12th or 14th, I guess. And then and certainly Bob and Diane are willing to have a look at it. So maybe if you guys draft it, throw something to them, or you guys have ideas, throw it to them, and I'm happy to help along. So I think that should be enough to get things moving forward, at least in terms of our thinking. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about? You have your chapter volunteer assignments, and you should have all gotten a table, I think, and did you all, Edmund, did they all get the summary table?
I can go ahead and recirculate it afterwards, since it was just distributed today.
This is the summary table that says who has been assigned to what chapter, who volunteered for what chapter?
That is not a meeting material.
That's not what?
It's not a meeting material yet, but that's something that we could distribute if interested.
I don't recall seeing that already.
I want to bring up another topic real quick. We haven't seen that, but Diane brought up climate changes at the end. The last one is public involvement, consultation, and coordination. And I think our social scientists would agree that that needs to not be last, but probably really first to find out what the issues are. So maybe another topic that's kind of outside each chapter is order of chapters. And there may be other general things like that, that it's kind of, overview comments.
Yeah, and I don't know what that chapter is about. My guess is that chapter describes how they involved the public and coordinated and stuff like that. Public meetings and interviews or
Many of
whatever.
the chapters, it's possible that many of the chapters are required by CEQA, and they typically are given in an order. So I think until we see the content, we shouldn't necessarily be too concerned about that, because they've probably done at least some integration they would have to. So we'll see. Yeah.
So let me kind of summarize this table a little bit. You've all put in a chapters that you feel comfortable with, chapters that you might work on. I guess the way Edmund, you got a 1 if you volunteered to lead it or had a main capability in there. If you are, it gave you a 0.5 if it's not your primary expertise, but you're willing to work on it. And I guess a 0.2 if you said, well, maybe if push came to shove. So anyway, bottom line is, in each of the chapters, we have, like 3.35, 3.5, 5.4 individuals. So mostly enough individuals to work on it, although there are some chapters, such as aesthetics and visual resources, cultural resources, public service and utilities, mineral resources, and paleontology, for example, that we have no volunteers. Now, we've had in the past, we had chapters that we had no volunteers, and we just did not review those chapters. And and I think we'd have to go back and look and see how many pages they are and what's relevant to see whether we need to drum up support to do that. There's a couple of other chapters where we only have, such as noise and air quality and greenhouse gases, where we only have 1 individual for those. But I think it's trying to think of the best way to do this. But so bottom line is, most of the chapters we have 2, 3, or 4 individuals assigned to, which I think is fine. You might want to reconsider once you look at the page numbers and what if that would make a difference or not. I'm trying to think if there's another way to do this. I don't know that we necessarily want to make public who's the lead authors. Did we do that in the past, Edmund?
We have, but once you make that document as a public meeting material, it'll be on, it'll be on it on who's working on
Okay, well, I think folks should have a look at the page numbers and see if they have any thoughts about if they want to change things, and maybe Edmund send out a list of, maybe a thing to do is to send out a list of chapters that have one or fewer members signed up, and that way we'll see where we have some gaps. Diane?
So could you send us an update of what we volunteered for? Is that on a Google Doc somewhere, or send a link?
Yeah, Edmund, do you have that you could send out to individuals?
Yeah, so based off the new information, we could re-update the meeting material for the next meeting, yes.
So I should go to the meeting material?
Yes, we'll provide you with more guidance after the meeting.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, and at present, there should be a big draft written across this because it's all subject to us seeing what's actually in the content.
Yeah.
The good example is climate change. I think I volunteered to do part of that as well, but it really depends. And we actually have 5.5 people for that. But depending on what the content of that is, and now that I look at 5, I might drop off and go to another topic. So there's a lot of fluidity left yet in this chapter assignments.
Yeah, I'm concerned I volunteered for several long chapters.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I went down for terrestrial too, but that's 530 pages. I've all of a sudden think I'm more of a fish guy. Okay. And I might add that these page numbers, you've all looked at environmental impact reviews before, and oftentimes much of the text is very, very, very repetitive. If they're going to look at species A, then there's 15 pages, 25 pages for that. B, all they do is change one parameter, 25 pages for that. So some of this stuff is far more less burdensome than others because there's a lot of repetition, particularly when they're looking at different alternatives. And the alternatives in some cases don't make a difference, so there's much repetitive language. So I guess we'll have to, as soon as we get that, we're going to probably need to call a meeting and have after people have had a chance just to glance through it and then see where we are and get serious about it then. Any other thoughts on this topic? Yes, Lisa.
I use the manual raise hand. So we do see now some of the models that have been used. I wonder, along the lines of what Bob was asking, should we, well, maybe there's written materials. I don't know. We could start trying to get up to speed a little bit on the models. See our comfort level. It could be through presentations. It could be through people suggesting documents to us. That's all I got.
I'm wondering if, just thinking out loud, if there will be an awful lot of citations in there, I'm sure. And I'm just wondering if we have a resource admin that where if we ever want to look at one of those, unless they have a hot link to it, that there's a process where we can look at some of the primary literature related to some of the key processes they're using.
It would be important because a lot of those models have many versions, and so we'd want to know which version they used. So yeah, we need an insider to point us in the right direction, I suspect.
Okay, any other thoughts? All right, Edmund, any public comments on this topic?
Yes, we have 2 oral comments. We'll go in the order of Deirdre Desjardins first and Osha Meserve. For your public comments, please state your name and affiliation if applicable before providing your public comment. Thank Deirdre, you have the ability to.
Thanks. It's Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I just wanted to say there are some known limitations of the models. The calcium 2 model created 200,000 acre feet of water that wasn't there in dry and critically dry years. The calcium 3 model has improved. It was related to the modeling of they call them depletion study areas, where you irrigate the rice farms in the Sac Valley and there's precipitation and there's runoff from the rice farms, and they didn't have mass balance in the model. So it's somewhat it's improved in the calcium 3 model, but calcium 3 still, they wouldn't produce the calibration information for dry and critically dry years, and I was pressing them for it. And there's a major issue that the calcium 3 projected that State Water Project customers would get 33% of, it's called Table A, their Table A contracts in a repeat of a 76-77 drought, and they're only getting 5%. And it's clear there's a problem there. And the delivery capability report says, well, we'll wait and see if this is part of a long-term shift, but it's becoming very clear that there's aridification in California. And the other issue is that the climate models they used what was called the central tendency projection of the ensembles of models. It sounds like they've changed the models they used, which was partly based on my testimony in the water fix hearing. There's a set of curated models by the Climate Change Technical Advisory Group. So that's a better approach, but it's still really an issue because of the kinds of drying we've seen, if that adequately represents the kinds of drying that we're seeing in the watershed. So I want to get you that information. And the other thing I was like, oh, but is to look at the finding of best available science. So the Delta Stewardship Council found that the Department of Water Resources didn't use best available science on sea level rise in the previous project, and that was based on my testimony in the water fix hearing. And I do want to get you that information. That particular section of the draft consistency finding is pretty key to look at. So thank you.
Hey, thanks, Deirdre. Next one, Edmund.
Yes, the next one will be OSHA. OSHA, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I'm sorry to keep you one more minute, but I'll be very brief. Ocean Reserve, local agencies of the North Delta, and thank you for taking the time to think through what the review may look like. And it sounds like you guys are on a good pathway to take on this behemoth. I do think I heard a little bit of discussion at the beginning of this item about, potentially hearing from others, and I think that would and could be very useful. You are scientists, I am an attorney. I think, we all know how to use our professional filters to filter through, to make judgment calls about what information is important for your use. But especially since the DISB has heard many times from DWR, the proponent of the project, who is advocating for the project directly, I think it would be appropriate for the DISB to also hear from a panel of other experts about what some of the issues that people have been concerned about over the course of this project development, and what we think may be important in this review as well. And then I would leave it to your expertise to sort through that of what may be helpful. And just as an example, in the last round of review of the water fix, there were certain impacts for which it was claimed that there was no significant impact and that it was mitigated to less than significant. And for instance, water quality and salinity was under that rubric. And I want to make sure that when the board reviews the documents, that it looks at those types of determinations very critically, and to the extent those determinations aren't supported by best available science, that there are comments about that. As for instance, as was discussed, the time step, a monthly time step model really doesn't capture conditions on the ground. You've got 4 million people in the Delta reliant on good quality water, whether salinity or other parameters, that's on a moment to moment basis, not a month. And so anyway, that's just one example. And then the last point I'll make is just with alternatives. I think that could be something that might be a little outside the box of the chapters, but there are alternatives to create water supplies that this document may not look at, like upper watershed restoration, wet meadows, groundwater recharge, flood mar, field mar, all those things, and conservation, of course. So I think all those would be within the realm, should you so choose, of comments that you may provide within your expertise. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Edmund, any more?
There are no additional public comments.
Okay, any public comments for matters not on the agenda?
There are none. Actually, sorry, there is one. From Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Deirdre Desjardins again. And just for the new members, I stepped in to help the Delta Independent Science Board and advocate for having funding for their contracts restored last year. And I thought my role was done because the contracts were restored and they have 2 new postdocs and a staff person assigned and so on. But this year in the budget, they proposed $100 million for water management science. And some of it's going to go towards the State Water Resources Control Board for water rights quantification and modeling of, watersheds and drought. Some will go to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, some to Department of Water Resources. I was able to verify from the Senate that there wasn't any additional funding proposed for the Delta Independent Science Board, and I was concerned. I know you're getting up to speed on this and you may have too much on your plate already. We do think you bring an incredibly valuable independent perspective. I've been tracking this. It's still up in the air. It's going to be part of negotiations after the budget's in print, but our best information I have from the lobbyist we hired last year is that that's still under negotiation. At some point, it would be really nice if either the Delta Stewardship Council gave you a briefing on this, which I've been pushing for, and conveyed your wishes to the Senate, or I knew enough to figure out what sort of resources you might need, or if you were feeling like it would be too much. And I did send some letters to you about it. That's all.
Okay, thanks, Deidre. I think we are getting a legislative update tomorrow from the council.
Good to hear.
Okay, I think we are ready for recess. We will, we don't adjourn, we'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 in the morning, Pacific time. So
Thank you.
have a good evening.